Berlin, November 1923. A German housewife leaves her home carrying a wheelbarrow. It is not full of groceries. It is not full of coal for the winter. It is full of money. Billions of marks stacked high, bound in rubber bands just to buy a single loaf of bread. By this point, $1 was worth 4 trillion German marks. 4 trillion. Prices were doubling not every week, not every day, but every few hours. Workers were being paid twice a day, so they could spend their wages before they lost half their value by lunchtime. This was not a natural disaster. It was not a war. It was a financial system in total, catastrophic collapse. And the consequences would change the entire world. To understand how Germany reached this point, we need to go back. Back to 1918, the end of World War I. Germany had lost. 4 years of brutal war had left the country shattered, millions dead, cities are exhausted, the economy is in ruins. And then came the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. The victorious Allied powers Britain, France, and the United States imposed a peace settlement that many Germans considered a national humiliation. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war. Its military was gutted. Large territories were taken away, and then came the bill. Or reparations of 132 billion gold marks, an almost incomprehensible sum. Germany was to pay for the entire cost of the war it had, according to the Allies, started. For a country already on its knees, this was devastating. The new German government, the Weimar Republic, established in 1919, was born into a crisis it did not create and was barely equipped to handle. The Weimar Republic was Germany's first real attempt at democracy. It was fragile from the start. The political landscape was violently divided between communists on the far left and nationalists on the far right. Street fights were common. Political assassinations happened in broad daylight. Now, on top of all that, the government had to figure out how to pay an almost unpayable debt. The man at the center of the financial system was Rudolf Havenstein, president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. He was a conservative, old-fashioned financier who believed deeply in one solution: print more money. The German government had been printing money to fund the war since 1914. That was not unusual. Most warring nations did the same. But after the war, they kept printing. The logic was simple, if dangerous. Germany owed reparations in gold-backed foreign currencies. The German mark was not worth enough to meet those obligations, so the government printed more marks, trying to buy the foreign currency it needed. It was like trying to fill a leaking bucket by adding more water at the top. Every new mark printed made every existing mark worth a little less. Inflation crept upward through 1919 and 1920. Prices rose. People noticed. But it was still manageable. Then came January 1921. The Allied Reparations Commission confirmed the full schedule. Germany owed 132 billion gold marks to be paid in annual installments. The first large payment was due immediately. Germany paid, but the strain on the economy was visible. The mark began to slide faster. By the middle of 1921, $1, which had bought around 60 marks before the war, was buying 330 marks. Still painful, but not yet catastrophic. Then Germany missed a payment. In December 1921, Germany declared it could not meet its reparations obligations in full. It asked for a moratorium, a pause in payments while the economy recovered. The Allies refused. And then France made a decision that would ignite the crisis. January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's most important industrial region. Coal mines, steel factories, railways, the economic heart of the country. Their message was direct. If Germany would not pay in money, France would take payment in resources. The German government responded with what it called passive resistance. Workers in the Ruhr were ordered to go on strike, refuse to cooperate, shut down production. The government would pay the striking workers, but the government had no money, so it printed more. Between January and November 1923, the German money supply exploded. The Reichsbank printed marks by the billions, then the trillions, then the quadrillions. The numbers became surreal. In January 1923, a US dollar bought 18,000 marks. By July 1923, it bought 350,000. By September, 1 million. By November, 4 trillion. The mark had ceased to function as a currency. It was paper. It was wallpaper. Literally, people used stacks of it to insulate their homes. Children played with bricks of banknotes in the street. Artists painted on the blank sides of obsolete currency. The middle-class teachers, doctors, civil servants, pensioners watched their savings evaporate overnight. People who had spent their entire lives building financial security were suddenly destitute. A pension that had been worth a comfortable retirement was now worth less than a postage stamp. Trust in institutions collapsed alongside the currency. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, already despised by many, seemed to be dissolving before everyone's eyes. And somewhere in the chaos, a failed artist and decorated war veteran named Adolf Hitler was watching very closely. The German government knew it had to act. A new currency was announced in November 1923. A new plan to stabilize the economy was put in place. The hyperinflation technically was halted. But stopping the bleeding was not the same as healing the wound. The damage ran far deeper than anyone fully understood. Millions of Germans had not just lost their savings, they had lost their faith in democracy, in institutions, in the entire system that had failed them so completely. That loss of faith would prove far more dangerous than the inflation itself. The new currency was called the Rentenmark. It was introduced on November 15, 1923. And it was backed not by gold. Germany had almost none left, but by a mortgage on Germany's agricultural land and industrial assets. It was, in financial terms, an unusual arrangement. Some economists called it a bluff. But it worked. The hyperinflation stopped almost immediately. 1 Rentenmark was set equal to 1 trillion old marks. The exchange rate to the dollar stabilized at 4.2 Rentenmarks, exactly where it had stood before the war. The man who made this happen was Hjalmar Schacht, the newly appointed currency commissioner. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly unsentimental. Cut government spending hard. He stopped the printing presses. He enforced the new currency with the kind of cold discipline the Weimar Republic had never shown before. Within months, prices stabilized. Shops restocked their shelves. The wheelbarrows of money disappeared from the streets. On the surface, it looked like a miracle. But miracles have a way of concealing what lies beneath. The human cost of the hyperinflation was permanent. The middle class had been financially destroyed. The life savings of an entire generation were gone. Resentment toward the Republic, toward the Allies. The perceived architects of Germany's humiliation was deep and unforgiving. And the political extremists on both ends of the spectrum had taken careful note. The years between 1924 and 1929 became known as the Golden Twenties in Germany. Foreign investment, particularly from the United States, poured into the German economy. American banks extended enormous loans under the Dawes Plan of 1924. A new reparations arrangement that restructured Germany's payment schedule and injected capital into the struggling economy. Berlin became a cultural capital. Art, music, theater, cinema. The city buzzed with a kind of desperate, brilliant energy. The Bauhaus movement was redefining architecture and design. Writers and philosophers debated in cafes. Jazz played in packed clubs until dawn. On the surface, it looked like recovery. It looked like Germany had survived the worst. But the foundations were unstable. Behind the bright lights, the structural problems had not been solved. They had simply been papered over this time, not with printed marks, but with borrowed dollars. Germany's apparent recovery was built almost entirely on borrowed money. American loans funded German reparations payments to France and Britain, who in turn used that money to repay their own war debts to the United States. It was a circular system, a chain of debt held together by American credit. And American credit in 1929 was about to snap. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the New York Stock Exchange began its catastrophic collapse. The great crash had arrived. American banks, facing their own crisis at home, began calling in their foreign loans immediately. The money that had been flowing into Germany for 5 years suddenly reversed direction. The effect on the German economy was immediate and devastating. Banks began to fail. Companies began to collapse. Unemployment, which had fallen to around 1.3 million in 1929, began to climb with terrifying speed. By 1930, it had reached 3 million. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were out of work. Nearly 1 in 3 workers. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg filled with desperate men, veterans, factory workers, former civil servants. People who had already survived the trauma of hyperinflation now faced the complete collapse of employment. Families lost their homes. Soup kitchens stretched around city blocks. Men in suits, accountants, engineers, former managers stood in bread lines alongside factory workers. The humiliation was total. And this time, there were no wheelbarrows of money. There was simply nothing. The political consequences were immediate. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party, which had received just 2.6% of the vote in 1928, suddenly won 18.3% and became the second largest party in the German parliament. In 2 years, in one election, the message to any serious observer was unmistakable. The economic crisis was translating directly into political extremism at a speed that the moderate parties of the Weimar Republic were completely unprepared for. Hitler's speeches were economic speeches as much as they were political ones. He blamed the banks. He blamed the Allies. He blamed the terms of Versailles. He offered simple explanations for complex catastrophes, and to a population that had suffered twice in a decade, simple explanations were deeply appealing. The government responded to the depression with austerity, cutting spending, raising taxes, reducing benefits. It was economically conventional advice. It was also socially catastrophic. Every cut made the suffering worse. Every reduction in benefits pushed more desperate people toward the extremes. Chancellor after chancellor fell, governments collapsed. Emergency decrees replaced parliamentary debate. By 1931, Germany's largest bank, the Donut Bank, collapsed. Panic spread through the banking system. The German government declared a banking holiday, freezing accounts across the country. Ordinary Germans arrived at their banks to find the doors locked and their money inaccessible. For many, especially those who remembered 1923, it felt like the beginning of the end. By the summer of 1932, the Weimar Republic was a democracy in name only. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning had governed largely by emergency decree, bypassing parliament entirely. He was forced out of office in May 1932, dismissed by President Paul von Hindenburg, who was being heavily pressured by conservative industrialists and aristocrats who believed they could use a rising politician to restore order. That politician was Adolf Hitler. The Nazi vote peaked at 37.4% in July 1932. It was the largest share any single party had ever received in a free German election. Hitler did not have a majority. He could not simply take power. But the men around Hindenburg believed they could control him. He believed he was a useful instrument, a populist loudmouth who would stabilize the country and then step aside when they were done with him. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. They were wrong about everything. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor was not the end of the Weimar Republic. It was an autopsy. Within weeks, the legal mechanisms of German democracy were dismantled with surgical precision. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, a mysterious blaze that destroyed Germany's parliament building, gave Hitler the pretext he needed. Emergency powers were invoked. Civil liberties were suspended. Communist and socialist politicians were arrested. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler the power to rule by decree indefinitely, without parliamentary approval. Germany's first democracy was over. The men who had appointed Hitler believing they could control him found themselves sidelined, silenced, or imprisoned within months. The economic consequences of this political catastrophe were profound and immediate. Hitler's government launched a massive program of public spending, infrastructure projects, rearmament, construction. The economics were, in a narrow sense, effective. Unemployment fell sharply. From 6 million in 1932 to under 1 million by 1938, but the method was terrifying. The economy was being rebuilt for war. Every factory retooled, every worker reemployed. Every mark spent was preparation for a military expansion that would ultimately consume Europe. The financial tools developed to stabilize the currency in 1923 and to manage recovery in the late 1920s were now being deployed in service of catastrophe. The immediate economic transformation under Hitler was visible and seductive to a population that had suffered 15 years of financial trauma. Prices were stable. Jobs were available. Order, violent, imposed, ruthless, had replaced the chaos of the Republic's final years. For many ordinary Germans, exhausted by hyperinflation, unemployment, and political instability, it felt like rescue. That was precisely the point. Nazi propaganda was built around the narrative of economic salvation. Posters celebrated the new highways, the Autobahn, built by German workers with German hands. Newspapers reported falling unemployment figures. Families who had stood in bread lines 3 years earlier now had work, wages, and a sense of national purpose. The regime understood something that economists often miss. Perception matters as much as reality. If people believe the economy is improving, if they can feel it in their daily lives, they will support the system that delivered it, regardless of what that system costs in other ways. The Nazi economic miracle was, in financial terms, largely illusory. It was funded by deficit spending on a scale that far exceeded anything the Weimar Republic had attempted. New financial instruments called Mefo bills, essentially off books. Government bonds disguised the true scale of military borrowing from the public and from international observers. By 1938, Germany's military spending was consuming over 50% of government expenditure. The economy was a weapon, and it was being loaded. The Weimar hyperinflation and the subsequent collapse that brought Hitler to power left lasting marks on global financial history, marks that can still be felt today. The trauma of 1923 became embedded in German institutional memory in ways that shaped economic policy for generations. The Bundesbank, Germany's post-war central bank, was built around a single obsession. Never again allow inflation to destroy the currency and the social trust that depends on it. That same philosophy was written into the founding charter of the European Central Bank decades later. The international response to the Great Depression, which had accelerated Weimar's collapse, was studied and analyzed by every subsequent generation of economists and policymakers. John Maynard Keynes, who had warned at the time of Versailles that punishing reparations would destabilize Europe, was vindicated in the most devastating way possible. When the 2008 global financial crisis arrived, central banks around the world took actions directly informed by the lesson that austerity during a collapsing economy makes things catastrophically worse. The Marshall Plan of 1948, America's post-World War II rebuilding program for Europe, was explicitly designed to avoid the mistakes of Versailles. Rather than extracting wealth from a defeated Germany, the United States pumped money into rebuilding it. The lesson of Weimar had been learned at enormous cost. The Bretton Woods system of 1944, which established the post-war international monetary order, was designed explicitly to prevent the currency instability and competitive devaluation that had wrecked economies in the 1920s and 1930s. And the European Union itself, an institution built on the conviction that economic integration prevents war, was at its deepest level, a response to what happened when Germany's economy broke down and its democracy could not survive the wreckage. Every major institution of modern global finance carries, in its design, the shadow of what went wrong in Weimar Germany. The story of the Weimar Republic is not simply a story about inflation. It is a story about what happens when financial systems fail, the people who depend on them. When savings disappear overnight, people do not become philosophers, they become desperate. When governments cannot provide stability, people do not wait patiently. They look for someone who promises certainty regardless of the cost. The hyperinflation of 1923 did not directly create Hitler. It was one chapter in a longer collapse, but it destroyed the savings of an entire generation. It annihilated trust in democratic institutions, created the psychological conditions in which extremism could take root. Money is not just a means of exchange, it is a social contract, a promise between a government and its people. When that promise breaks, when the paper in your pocket becomes worthless while you hold it, something deeper breaks with it. The Weimar Republic paid for that broken promise with its existence, and the world paid for it with a war that killed more than 70 million people. Some lessons cost more than others. This was the most expensive lesson in modern history. If this documentary changed the way you think about economic collapse, its financial history, and the hidden forces behind political catastrophe, please like this video and subscribe. Subscribe for more deep financial history documentaries. History always has something left to teach us.